The morning sun barely penetrated the grimy windows of Pine Valley Assisted Living, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum where George Brennan sat in his wheelchair, hands folded in his lap, staring at nothing in particular. He was 75 years old, with silver hair that still held traces of the dark brown it once was, and hands that trembled slightly from age and disappointment. Beside him, in a matching wheelchair though she could still walk with a cane, sat Martha, his wife of 53 years. She was 73, with kind eyes that had seen too much hurt and a smile that had grown rare over the past 18 months. They sat in what the staff called the community room, though there was nothing communal about the dozen or so residents scattered about like forgotten furniture, each lost in their own worlds of memory and medication. The television played some morning talk show no one watched. The coffee was cold. The air smelled of industrial cleaner and resignation, that particular scent of places where people go not to live but to wait. Martha reached over and squeezed George's hand. He squeezed back without looking at her. They didn't need words anymore. After 5 decades together, they'd learned to speak in silence, in touches, in the weight of shared grief that sat between them, like a third presence, constant and heavy. "Today's the day," Martha whispered finally, her voice barely audible over the drone of daytime television. George nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. 36 hours. Until they move us. The "they" referred to the state. Pine Valley was closing. Budget cuts. The director had explained with practiced sympathy, the kind that sounds genuine but costs nothing. All residents would be transferred to various facilities across 3 counties. George and Martha would be separated. Different buildings, different towns, maybe different worlds, for all they knew. The director had been very sorry about that, truly sorry. But rules were rules, policies were policies. Married couples could stay together only if they could afford private care. George and Martha could not. Their children could have helped, should have helped, but their children were gone. Not dead, just gone. 3 children. Once upon a time, Michael, the oldest, a corporate lawyer in Seattle, with a corner office and a view of the harbor. Sarah, the middle child, a real estate agent in Phoenix who sold million-dollar homes to people with more money than sense. And Daniel, the youngest, who worked in finance somewhere in New York, doing something with hedge funds that George had never fully understood. Each successful, each busy, each gradually, then suddenly, absent. The calls had stopped first. Then the holiday visits. Then the birthday cards. Then everything, like a light being slowly dimmed, until finally someone just turned it off completely. When George had his first stroke 2 years ago, Michael sent flowers to the hospital with a card that read, "Get well soon, Dad. Love, Michael." He didn't visit. He didn't call. Just flowers, probably ordered by his secretary, beautiful and meaningless. When Martha's hip gave out last year, and she needed surgery, Sarah texted, "Thinking of you, Mom, so swamped with work right now. You understand." She didn't call. She didn't come. Just a text message, 10 words, to cover the absence of presence. When they'd been forced to sell their small house to pay medical bills and moved into Pine Valley, Daniel sent an email. "Wow, big change. Hope you're settling in okay. Things are crazy here." He didn't come. He didn't offer to help. Just an email, typed between meetings, forgotten as soon as it was sent. And then, nothing. 18 months of silence so complete it felt like death. Except George and Martha were still breathing, still hoping against hope that the phone would ring, that a letter would come, that someone would remember they existed. Martha had cried herself hollow those first few months. George had watched helplessly as his strong, resilient wife dissolved into someone he barely recognized, someone fragile and lost. She'd written letters, dozens of them, pouring her heart onto pages that went unanswered. She'd left voicemails, her voice growing smaller each time, more uncertain, more desperate. "It's Mom. Just checking in. Miss you. Call when you can." Then, "It's Mom again. Haven't heard from you. Everything okay?" Then, "It's your mother. Please call back." George had tried too, in his way. Emails to Michael about the stroke, about how scared he'd been, about how he kept thinking about mortality and regrets. No response. Texts to Daniel about needing advice on financial paperwork, hoping work talk might bridge the gap. Read receipts showed Daniel had seen them, but he never replied. A long letter to Sarah about how much he missed her, how he remembered teaching her to ride a bike, how he was proud of the woman she'd become. It came back unopened, marked "Return to sender," which meant she'd moved and hadn't bothered to tell them. Eventually, they stopped trying. Not because they stopped caring, but because the pain of reaching out into silence became worse than the silence itself. Now, sitting in the community room with 36 hours until they'd be torn apart, George and Martha faced a truth more terrifying than death. They would die alone, separated, forgotten by the people they'd given everything to create. "I won't live apart from you," Martha said suddenly, her voice stronger now, cutting through the drone of television and the soft snoring of Mr. Henderson 3 chairs over. "I won't do it." George turned to look at her finally. Really look at her. Her face was lined with age and sorrow, her hair more gray than the auburn he remembered from their wedding day. But her jaw was set with determination he recognized from their youth, from the woman who'd stood beside him through lean years and hard choices, through factory layoffs and mortgage struggles, and the kind of marriage that had bent but never broken. "Neither will I," he said quietly, firmly. "So we do what we talked about." "Well, I-4, Martha nodded. From her cardigan pocket, she pulled out a folded newspaper clipping, smoothed it carefully on her lap. The paper was worn from repeated reading, the edges soft as cloth from being touched. Folded, unfolded, studied like a map, to treasure or escape. Maybe both. Estate auction. Historic Victorian mansion. 12 acres. As is condition. Minimum bid, $12,000. Serious inquiries only. They'd found it 3 weeks ago when volunteer Patricia had left her newspaper on the community room table. Patricia came Tuesdays and Thursdays to read to residents. A sweet gesture that George appreciated, even though the books she chose were usually terrible. That particular Tuesday, she'd left her paper behind, and Martha had been idly flipping through it when she'd seen the listing. The photograph showed a towering 3-story Victorian, its paint peeling in long strips like bark from a dying tree, its wraparound porch sagging dangerously on the left side, its windows dark as empty eyes. It sat at the end of an overgrown drive, surrounded by ancient oaks and decades of neglect. The listing described it as structurally sound, but requiring extensive renovation, which George translated as still standing but barely. Everyone said it was unsellable. The article quoted locals calling it the Money Pit on Marlow Street, the eyesore, the haunted house where old Theodore Ashford died alone 42 years ago. No one had lived there since. The previous owner, a reclusive art dealer, had died intestate. The property had been tied up in probate for years, while distant relatives fought over an estate that included nothing but debt and decay. Now the county just wanted it gone, wanted it off their books, wanted someone else to deal with the problem. George and Martha had exactly $14,733 to their name. The last remnants of their house sale, after medical bills had eaten through everything else like acid through paper. It was meant to be their emergency fund, their final safety net, the thing that would keep them from being completely destitute. "We'll spend everything," George said, voicing the fear they'd both been carrying. "If we're wrong about this, if the house is worse than we think, if we can't make it work, then we're wrong together." Martha interrupted, her hand finding his and squeezing hard. "In our own home, not in separate buildings where they feed us pills and wait for us to die." George felt something stir in his chest, something that had been dormant so long he'd almost forgotten it existed. Hope. Fragile, dangerous hope. That afternoon, they called the number from the ad. A bored-sounding clerk named Beverly answered, clearly surprised anyone was interested. "The Ashford place," she'd said, voice rising in disbelief. "You're serious?" "Very serious," Martha replied, her voice steady. "Well, okay then. The auction's tomorrow at noon. You'll need to register in person by 11. Cash or cashier's check if you're planning to bid." She paused. "Ma'am, I should tell you, I've driven past that place. It's in really bad shape. No heat, no working plumbing, roof leaks, foundation issues. You'd essentially be buying a restoration project. And a massive one at that." "We're well aware," Martha said. "We'll be there," Beverly sighed. "Your funeral, I guess. See you tomorrow." After she hung up, George looked at his wife with something approaching admiration mixed with terror. "You think we can actually do this? At our age? With no money once we buy it?" Martha smiled for the first time in months. Really smiled, the expression lighting up her face in a way that reminded George of who she'd been before grief had dimmed her. "George, we raised 3 ungrateful children who turned into strangers. We survived 30 years of factory work that broke your back and my spirit. We made it through your cancer, my broken hip, strokes, and surgeries and bills that never stopped coming. If we can survive all that, we can survive fixing up an old house. Or die trying," George added. But he was smiling too. "Or die trying," Martha agreed. "But at least we'll die together, in our own home, on our own terms, making our own choices instead of having choices made for us." That evening, they packed. It didn't take long. Between them, they had 2 battered suitcases of clothes, a cardboard box of photographs mostly of their children at various ages, smiling faces that felt like they belonged to different people. Now, Martha's mother's china, carefully wrapped in newspaper. George's toolbox from his factory days, rusty but still functional, and a framed wedding photo from 53 years ago. Everything else had been sold or thrown away when they'd moved to Pine Valley, a lifetime reduced to what could fit in the trunk of a taxi. The night staff thought they were simply organizing, tidying up, the kind of activity the director encouraged to keep residents' minds active. George and Martha didn't correct them. They didn't mention that they were preparing to leave, preparing to take the biggest risk of their lives, preparing to choose freedom and uncertainty over safety and separation. The next morning, they dressed in their nicest clothes, George in a button-down shirt that hung a bit loose on his shrinking frame, the collar no longer fitting quite right, and Martha in a floral dress she'd owned for 20 years. still beautiful but faded. Like them, they told the front desk they were going for their weekly outing with Patricia, the volunteer. The receptionist barely looked up, just nodded and waved them through. They didn't mention Patricia had no idea they were coming, that they'd never arranged any outing. Instead, they called a taxi. The driver was a young man named Marco, with kind eyes and a gentle manner. He helped them load their bags without asking questions, though George saw him glance at the overstuffed suitcases with curiosity. "Where to, folks?" he asked. Once they were settled in the back seat, George gave him the address of the county administrative building. Marco whistled low. "That's a 45-minute drive. Kind of far. You folks sure?" "Very sure," Martha said, patting his shoulder from the back seat. "It's the most important appointment of our lives." "Well, all right then," Marco said, smiling in the rearview mirror. "Let's get you there." The drive took them through countryside that had once been familiar, past the factory where George had worked for 30 years before automation and outsourcing had eliminated his job, past the elementary school where their children had learned to read, past the diner where the family used to go for pancakes on Sunday mornings. Every landmark was a memory, and every memory hurt. Martha stared out the window, silent tears tracking down her cheeks. George held her hand, his own vision blurred. The courthouse was exactly what you'd expect. Bureaucratic, fluorescent lit, and indifferent. Grey carpets, grey walls, grey faces of civil servants counting down to retirement. George and Martha registered for the auction at a desk where a woman with reading glasses on a chain barely acknowledged them. They paid a small registration fee, $25, that made Martha wince, and sat on a wooden bench outside the auction room to wait. A handful of others trickled in, mostly contractors and house flippers with clipboards and calculating eyes, men in work boots and women in business casual, all looking professional and prepared. They glanced at George and Martha with barely concealed amusement, whispering to each other, probably wondering what two elderly people in wheelchairs were doing at an estate auction. One man in his 40s, wearing designer jeans and a leather jacket that probably cost more than George's monthly Social Security check, actually laughed when he saw them. He walked over, smirking. "You two here for the Ashford place?" he asked, tone somewhere between condescending and amused. George nodded, keeping his expression neutral. The man shook his head, grin widening. "No offense, Pops, but that property needs about $200,000 in work minimum. Probably closer to $3. Unless you've got a construction crew and deep pockets. You're wasting your time. Hell, I might not even bid on it, and I flip houses for a living." Martha smiled sweetly, the smile she used when she wanted to be polite to people she despised. "Thank you for your concern, dear. We'll manage just fine." The man laughed again and walked away, muttering something to his associate about old people not knowing when to quit. George squeezed Martha's hand. "We can still leave," he whispered. "We don't have to do this." Martha turned to him, her expression fierce. "Yes, we do. We have nowhere else to go, George. Nowhere that lets us stay together. This is our only chance." At exactly noon, the auctioneer called them into the auction room. The space was small, institutional, with about 20 folding chairs set up in rows. 12 people had shown up. The auctioneer, a thin woman with reading glasses and a no-nonsense expression, shuffled her papers and began. "We're here for the estate auction of the Ashford Victorian mansion located at 1847 Marlow Street. Property is sold as is. No warranties. No guarantees. Minimum bid is $12,000. Do I have 12? Minimum bid, The man in the leather jacket raised his paddle without hesitation. 12. Do I have 13? The auctioneer asked, scanning the room. Silence. Several people shifted in their seats, but didn't raise their paddles, going once at 12,000. 12,500. Martha's voice rang out, clear and strong, cutting through the silence like a bell. The room turned. Everyone stared. Leather Jacket looked annoyed, his smirk fading. 13, he counted. 14. Martha said immediately, without hesitation. George squeezed her hand, his heart racing so fast he worried about another stroke. They only had $14,733. If the bidding went much higher, they'd have nothing left for fees, for taxes, for anything. Leather Jacket frowned, glanced at his clipboard, did some mental math. 15, 16, Martha said, her voice still steady though George could feel her hand trembling in his. Leather Jacket turned to face her directly, his expression hardening. "Ma'am," he said, voice dripping with condescension, "with all due respect, do you understand what you're bidding on? That house is a complete disaster. Foundation's questionable. Electrical is probably shot. Plumbing's ancient. Roof leaks like a sieve. You'd be throwing money into a black hole. It's not worth 16,000, let alone what it would take to make it livable. Then stop bidding." Martha replied calmly, meeting his eyes without flinching. A few people chuckled nervously. The auctioneer's mouth twitched in what might have been approval. Leather Jacket's face reddened. He stood abruptly, grabbed his things, and walked toward the door. "Waste of time," he muttered loudly. "Let the old folks learn the hard way." The auctioneer looked around the room, scanning for other bidders. Anyone else? Silence. Profound, echoing silence. Going once at $16,000. George held his breath. Going twice. Martha squeezed his hand so hard it hurt. Sold to the couple in the back for $16,000. The gavel fell like thunder. Just like that, George and Martha Brennan owned a 3-story Victorian mansion they'd never seen in person, purchased with money they couldn't afford to spend, with absolutely no idea what they were doing or what they'd find when they got there. 2 hours later, after signing papers that made George's hand cramp, and handing over a cashier's check that left them with negative $1,267 in their account, thanks to fees no one had mentioned. Beforehand, George and Martha stood at the end of Marlow Street, staring at their new home. It was worse than the photograph. Much, much worse. The Victorian loomed against the grey afternoon sky, like something out of a Gothic horror novel. 3 stories of faded purple paint, cracked gingerbread trim hanging at odd angles, and windows so dirty they were nearly opaque. The wraparound porch sagged dangerously on the left side, boards missing or rotted through. Vines had consumed the entire east wall, creeping up to the 3rd floor like green tentacles. The front steps were missing 2 boards, creating gaps that looked like missing teeth. The yard was a jungle of weeds taller than Martha. Brambles and wild roses gone feral. Trash caught in the undergrowth. The neighborhood itself didn't help. Across the street, a man in a stained undershirt sat on his porch, drinking from a paper bag, watching them with dead eyes. Next door, a house with boarded windows had graffiti spray painted across the garage door, symbols George didn't recognize and didn't want to. 2 houses down, a dog chained in a yard barked endlessly, hoarse and desperate. The street itself was cracked and potholed, curbs broken, streetlights mostly dark even in daylight. This wasn't a neighborhood, It was a place people gave up on. "Oh, George," Martha whispered, her voice breaking. George said nothing. He couldn't speak. His hands trembled as he gripped the rusted iron gate, partially open, hanging crooked on one hinge. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to find a way back to Pine Valley, to accept separation as the price of sanity. They'd made a terrible mistake. The worst mistake of their lives. Behind them, their taxi driver Marco had waited, watching in his rearview mirror. Now he climbed out of the car, approaching them carefully. "Mr. and Mrs. Brennan?" he said softly. "You folks? Okay?" Neither answered. They just stared at the house, at the dream that had looked so different in a newspaper photograph, at the reality of their desperation, made manifest in peeling paint and broken boards. "Listen," Marco said gently. "I'll drive you back. No charge. Seriously, you don't have to do this. There's got to be other options." Martha turned to him slowly, and Marco saw tears streaming down her face. But when she spoke, her voice was steady, even fierce. "Young man, we have nowhere to go back to. In 36 hours, they're going to separate us, put us in different facilities. We'd rather die here, in our own home, together, than live apart for whatever time we have left." Marco's eyes widened. He looked at George, who nodded confirmation. "Then let me help you with your bags," Marco said finally, his voice thick with emotion. Together, the three of them walked through the gate, up the broken steps that groaned under their weight, across the porch that sagged ominously with each step, to the front door. George pulled out the key the county had given him, large, old-fashioned, brass, surprisingly heavy. It turned smoothly in the lock, which seemed almost miraculous given the state of everything else. The door swung open with a long, mournful creak that echoed through the interior like something alive, something that had been waiting. Inside was darkness and the overwhelming smell of abandonment, dust and mildew and decay. The scent of decades where nothing had moved, nothing had changed, nothing had lived. George found a light switch just inside the door. Clicked it. Nothing. Of course, nothing. The power had been off for 42 years. "Power's off," he said unnecessarily. "We'll get it turned on," Martha replied, her voice hollow. "Tomorrow." Somehow, they stood in the doorway as their eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom. Marco pulled out his phone, turned on the flashlight, and swept it across the interior. Shapes emerged from the darkness like ghosts becoming solid. A grand staircase straight ahead, its banister intact, but covered in dust so thick it looked like grey velvet. A parlor to the left, with furniture still draped in old sheets that might once have been white, but were now the color of old bones. A dining room to the right with a chandelier hanging askew, crystals catching the phone light and throwing small rainbows across water-stained walls. Water damage streaked the wallpaper in long brown stains. Plaster had fallen in chunks from the ceiling, littering the floor like snow. The hardwood floors were scratched and warped, buckled in places where water had seeped through. But underneath all the decay, beneath all the neglect, you could see what this house once was: elegant, grand, lovingly crafted with details that didn't exist anymore. "It's not so bad," Martha said, and they all knew she was lying. "It's terrible," George said, being honest. "Yes," Martha agreed, "but it's ours. It's ours, and we're together. Re's ours. We have not reasoned." Marco helped them bring in their suitcases, setting them in the front hall with visible reluctance. He looked at George and Martha, these two elderly people who'd just committed everything they had to a house that looked one strong wind away from collapse. and his face was full of worry. "Are you sure you'll be okay?" he asked one more time. "No," George said honestly. "But we're here anyway." Marco nodded slowly, pulled out his wallet, and handed George a business card. "My cell number's on there. If you need anything, a ride, help, anything, you call me, day or night." "I mean it." Martha hugged him. "You're brave as hell," Marco said. "Both of you. I hope this works out." See, after he left, George and Martha stood alone in the front hall of their new home, surrounded by darkness and dust, and the weight of a decision they couldn't take back. George found a broom in a kitchen closet, its bristles half rotted, but Martha used it anyway to clear spider webs from the dining room, each stroke raising clouds of dust that made them both cough. George tested the faucets, dry as bone. He checked the toilet, no water. He looked at the electrical panel, ancient, possibly dangerous, definitely not functional. As the sun began to set, casting orange light through the filthy windows and making the dust motes visible like snow in reverse, George and Martha spread a blanket they'd brought on the parlor floor and sat down together, backs against the wall, holding hands. "We can't even afford to turn the power on," George said quietly, reality setting in. "I don't know what we were thinking." Martha laid her head on his shoulder. "We were thinking we'd rather try and fail together than die apart in separate rooms. We'll have to eat what's in our pockets for the next week. We'll have to bathe at gas stations. We'll have to—" "George," Martha interrupted, squeezing his hand hard. "We've been through worse, have we?" he asked, genuinely uncertain. She thought about it for a long moment. "No," she admitted. "Maybe not. But we've been through a lot, and we're still here. We're still together." They sat in silence as darkness filled the house completely, listening to it breathe, the creak of settling beams, the rustle of wind through broken seals, the scratch of branches against windows, the skitter of small animals in the walls. "I miss them," Martha whispered into the darkness. George didn't need to ask who she meant. "I know. Michael's birthday is next week. He'll be 47. I know. Do you think they ever wonder about us? Do you think they know we almost got separated? Do you think they care?" George closed his eyes, his own throat tight with grief that never seemed to diminish, only change shape. "I think they've convinced themselves we're fine, that we chose this, that we wanted to disappear. But we wrote them. We called. We begged them to answer." "I know," George said again. "Because what else was there to say?" Their children had made their choices, and those choices had led George and Martha here, to this dark house in this forgotten neighborhood, to this desperate gamble that might be the last decision they ever made. Somewhere in the house, something skittered across the floor above them, probably mice, maybe rats. Outside, that dog was still barking. A car alarm went off, then stopped. A siren wailed in the distance. Life continued around them, indifferent to their struggle, uncaring about whether they survived this choice. "Tomorrow," Martha said finally, her voice firmer, "we start fixing this place." "With what money?" George asked, not unkindly, just factually. "With our hands. With whatever we can figure out. With whatever this house gives us. One day at a time, George. We don't have to fix everything tomorrow. We just have to make it one more day. Then another. Then another." George turned to look at his wife in the darkness, her profile barely visible in the faint light from the street. After 53 years, he still found her beautiful, not in the conventional way perhaps, not in the way magazines defined it, but in the way that mattered. Beautiful in her resilience, her refusal to surrender, her stubborn, unreasonable, impossible hope. "Okay," he said softly. "One day at a time." That night, they slept on the parlor floor, wrapped in their coats, using their suitcases as pillows. The house groaned and shifted around them like a ship at sea, settling into their presence, adjusting to having people inside it again after 42 years of being alone. George lay awake for hours, staring at the cracked ceiling barely visible in the darkness, wondering if this was the beginning of their comeback story or simply the last chapter of a very long defeat. But here's what he didn't know, what neither of them knew yet. Hidden somewhere in the walls and floors and bones of this broken house was a secret that would change everything. A secret kept by a lonely man named Theodore Ashford, who'd understood that some things are too precious to trust to a world that only values price tags. The house held more than decay. It held possibility. It held redemption. It held a fortune they couldn't imagine, and a purpose they'd never expected. But first, they had to survive long enough to find it. Either way, come morning, they would start to find out if hope was enough, if determination could overcome impossible odds, if two elderly people everyone had thrown away could build something that mattered from a house no one wanted. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one breath at a time, together. Dawn came cold and gray through the filthy windows of what George and Martha now called home, though shelter might have been more accurate, or perhaps refuge, or maybe just the place where they'd chosen to make their final stand. Martha woke first, her hip aching from sleeping on the hard floor, her breath visible in the chill October air. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back like cold water. The auction, the key, the enormous gamble they'd made with money they couldn't afford to lose. No, not a gamble, a choice. She looked at George, still asleep beside her, his face softer in rest, free from the worry lines that had deepened over the past 2 years like cracks in old leather. His breathing was raspy, congested from dust and cold. They'd need to find warmer blankets, somehow, before winter really set in. Whatever happened next, they were together. That had to count for something. That had to be worth the risk. Martha forced herself up, bones protesting every movement, joints stiff and screaming. She was 73 years old, and her body reminded her of that fact, every single morning with increasing insistence. She walked stiffly to the kitchen, each step a negotiation with pain. The linoleum was cracked and peeling, curling up at the edges like dried leaves. Cabinets hung crooked, their doors barely attached. Something had definitely died behind the stove, judging by the smell that hit her when she got close. Something small and forgotten, like them. But there was a window that looked out onto what must have once been a garden. Now a wilderness of overgrown roses, strangled by ragweed and wild vines. Morning light filtered through, dusty and pale but almost beautiful despite everything. Martha stood there for a long moment, hands braced on the counter, looking out at the tangled chaos and trying to see what it could become instead of what it was. She tried the kitchen faucet again, not expecting anything. Still dry. They would need to find the water main and figure out how to turn it on. She opened cabinets one by one, finding ancient canned goods left by the previous owner, relics from another lifetime. Tomato soup from 1978. The label faded to almost nothing. Green beans with rust eating through the can. A jar of something that might once have been pickles, but was now just murky liquid and shapes she didn't want to identify. Behind her, George appeared in the doorway, moving like a man 20 years older than he was, bent and shuffling. "Any coffee?" he asked, voice rough with sleep and dust. "No power, no water," Martha said, trying to keep her tone light despite the crushing weight of their situation. "But I'm sure there's a gas station nearby. We can at least wash up there. Maybe get something hot to drink." They ate granola bars from Martha's purse for breakfast, the kind she'd been hoarding from Pine Valley's snack cart, and split a bottle of water they'd bought at the courthouse yesterday. Then, working in silence born of long practice and shared determination, they began to assess their situation with the cold clarity of people who couldn't afford delusions. George found the water main in the basement, a terrifying space that made his chest tight with claustrophobia and fear. Stone walls slick with moisture, dirt floor that smelled of earth and rot, support beams that made him nervous every time he looked at them, wondering if they were load-bearing, wondering if the whole house might come down on their heads. But the main valve was there, ancient and crusted with rust. He turned it, his arthritic hands screaming in protest, the valve fighting him for every degree of rotation. It took 15 minutes of struggle before anything happened. Then the pipes groaned, deep and loud, like the house was waking up after a very long sleep. Water began to flow somewhere in the walls, rushing and gurgling. George climbed back upstairs to find Martha at the kitchen sink, where rust-brown water was pouring from the faucet, thick and ugly. "Let it run," George said. "Should clear eventually." It took almost an hour before the water ran clear, and even then it smelled faintly metallic. But it was water, real flowing water, and that felt like a miracle, like their first small victory. Martha discovered that one bathroom on the second floor still had a functioning toilet, though flushing it required filling the tank with a bucket of water hauled from the kitchen sink. Small victories. Tiny steps forward in a journey that stretched impossibly ahead of them. By mid-morning, they'd made a list of priorities written on the back of an old envelope. Get power restored somehow, make one room actually livable, secure food beyond granola bars, fix the front steps before someone fell through them and broke their neck. They had exactly negative $1,267 and no plan and no idea how to do any of it. George was standing in the overgrown front yard, trying to figure out if any of the porch boards could be salvaged or if they'd need to be completely replaced, which would require lumber they couldn't afford, when a voice startled him so badly he nearly dropped his screwdriver. "You actually bought this place?" He turned to see a young woman standing at the gate, early 20s, with pink-streaked hair pulled back in a messy bun, torn jeans that looked deliberately distressed, and a backpack slung over one shoulder covered in patches and pins. She looked like she'd walked off a college campus, which was jarring in this forgotten neighborhood, where everyone looked worn down by life. "We did," George said cautiously, straightening slowly, his back protesting. The young woman walked closer, studying the house with genuine interest instead of the mockery or pity George had come to expect. "Wow, this is amazing. My urban planning professor used to bring us here to discuss neighborhood decay and historic preservation. He said this house was architecturally significant. Queen Anne Victorian, right? 1880s. George had no idea. Architecture had never been his area. "If you say so." "I'm Riley," the young woman said, extending her hand with a warm smile. "Riley Chen." George froze, his hand halfway extended. Chen. The name hit him like cold water. He'd been specifically told by his son Michael, back when Michael still spoke to him, back before the silence, never to trust people with certain names. "They'll scam you," Michael had said during one uncomfortable conversation. George wished he could forget. You know how they are. George had thought it racist then, and thought it racist now. But the memory stung anyway, poisoned the moment. Riley noticed his hesitation immediately, her hand dropping, her smile turning awkward and uncertain. Sorry, I'm nosy. I live 3 blocks over. Saw people moving in yesterday. Nobody's lived here in decades. I was just curious. We're aware, George said, trying to soften his initial coldness, feeling ashamed of his hesitation, but not quite able to shake the discomfort. Martha appeared on the porch then, wiping dust from her hands onto her already filthy dress. "Hello there," she called out, her voice warm despite their circumstances. "Hi," Riley waved enthusiastically. "I was just telling your husband I used to study this house in college. It's really beautiful under all the neglect. The craftsmanship is incredible." Martha came down the steps carefully, testing each board before putting her full weight on it. "You think so? Because right now it just looks like the biggest mistake we've ever made." Riley laughed, the sound genuine and unforced. "No, seriously. Houses like this, they're worth saving. The craftsmanship doesn't exist anymore. The millwork alone, the plaster medallions, the hardwood floors, the original fixtures. This is living history. This matters." "History's expensive," George muttered, hammering at a loose board with more force than necessary. "Well," Riley said, shifting her backpack and pulling at one strap nervously, "I'm actually studying historic preservation at the university. Part of my program requires volunteer hours for hands-on experience. If you needed help, free help, I'd love to assist. Just for the experience, and maybe some photos for my portfolio." George and Martha exchanged glances. That wordless communication that comes from 53 years of marriage. "Why would you want to do that?" Martha asked, suspicious despite herself, despite wanting to believe in kindness. "We're complete strangers. You don't know us. This could be dangerous or stupid, or both." Riley shrugged, looking down at her worn sneakers. "Because places like this matter. Historic preservation isn't just about buildings. It's about communities, about keeping stories alive. And because..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I saw you two at the auction yesterday. I was there researching for a paper on estate sales and neighborhood revitalization. Everyone was laughing at you. The contractors, the flippers, even the auctioneer looked amused. I thought that was cruel. And then you won the bid anyway despite everyone saying you were crazy. That took guts. That took hope. I respect that." Something in Martha's chest loosened slightly. A knot she hadn't known was there, beginning to unravel. "You really want to help?" "I really do," Riley said, meeting her eyes directly. "Honestly, I'm free most afternoons after classes. I can't do everything. I'm just a student. But I'm young and strong, and I know a little about historic restoration. And honestly, I could use the portfolio project. Win, win." George wanted to say no. Pride demanded it. They'd raised 3 children without asking for handouts, survived decades without charity, maintained their dignity through everything. But pride was a luxury they couldn't afford anymore. Pride wouldn't fix the porch, or restore the power, or keep them from freezing when winter really arrived. "We can't pay you," he said bluntly, making sure she understood. "We don't have money. We barely have food." "Don't want money," Riley replied immediately. "Just let me document the process, and maybe teach me whatever you know about fixing things. Fair trade." Martha looked at George, George looked at Martha. After 53 years, entire conversations happened in those looks. Complex negotiations conducted through eye contact and slight expressions. "Okay," Martha said finally, taking a breath. "But we start slow. We barely know what we're doing ourselves. We're making this up as we go." Riley grinned, her whole face lighting up. "That's fine. Learning together is even better. More authentic anyway." Over the next week, a rhythm emerged from the chaos. A pattern that gave structure to days that might otherwise have collapsed into despair. George would wake at dawn, his internal clock still set to factory hours, despite years of retirement. Brew instant coffee with hot water from the one functioning faucet, and spend mornings mapping out what needed to be done. He made lists, prioritized tasks, tried to think strategically even though everything seemed equally urgent and impossible. Martha would work on clearing debris. Endless bags, full of accumulated neglect. Petrified newspapers from the 70s. Rotted curtains that disintegrated when touched. Mouse nests in every corner. Dead insects. Broken glass. Things too decomposed to identify. She filled garbage bag after garbage bag, dragging them to the curb for pickup, her arms aching, her back screaming, but refusing to stop because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant crying. Riley would show up around 2 in the afternoon, after her classes, with energy that exhausted George just watching. She brought tools borrowed from her university's workshop. Crowbars, hammers, protective gloves, dust masks. She taught them about lead paint remediation, showing them YouTube videos on her phone, explaining why they needed to be careful with certain surfaces. She showed them plaster repair techniques, how to mix compounds, how to patch holes without creating obvious seams. They made slow, aching progress that felt both monumental and completely inadequate. The front steps were stabilized with salvaged lumber George found in the basement. Old boards that were still solid, just dirty. The parlor was cleaned enough to set up camping cots Riley had donated from her own dorm room, insisting she preferred sleeping on her futon anyway. Power was restored after Martha called the electric company, and, through some combination of pleading and paperwork, Riley helped her navigate, got them on a low-income assistance program that reduced the deposit from $800 to $200. Money they barely had but somehow found. Small victories. Tiny steps forward, but forward nonetheless. But the emotional weight was harder to manage than the physical work. Heavier than any beam they lifted or debris they hauled. One afternoon in early November, while scraping wallpaper in what would eventually be their bedroom, Martha found herself crying without quite knowing why. The paper was stubborn, wouldn't come off in strips like Riley said it should, kept tearing into tiny pieces that clung to the wall with supernatural determination. And suddenly she was sitting on the floor, scraper in hand, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe. George found her there 20 minutes later, lowered himself painfully beside her despite his protesting knees, and held her without speaking, without trying to fix it, just being present in her grief. "I'm sorry," Martha finally managed between gasps. I keep thinking about them. I can't stop. I know, Michael's birthday was yesterday. 47 years old. I didn't even know how to reach him to say happy birthday. I don't have his current address. His number's disconnected. It's like he vanished. George pulled her closer, his own throat tight. "I know. What did we do wrong, George? How did we raise 3 children who could just forget us, who could walk away like we never existed?" Her voice broke completely on the last word, dissolving into fresh sobs. It was the question she'd asked 100 times in 100 different ways. The question that had no answer, no resolution, just endless variations of the same unbearable mystery. "Maybe we loved them too much," George said quietly, voicing a theory he'd been developing in the dark hours before dawn. "Maybe we made life too easy, solved all their problems, protected them from consequences. Maybe we never taught them what struggle teaches you, that you need people, that family matters, that you can't make it alone. Or maybe we just failed," Martha whispered against his shoulder. "Maybe we were terrible parents, and we never knew it." "Maybe," George agreed, "because lying would help nothing. But Martha, we can't change them. We can't make them care. We can only change us. And right now, right here, we're building something. It's hard, and it hurts, and I don't know if it'll work, but we're trying. That has to mean something." Martha nodded against his shoulder, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks in the dust on her face. "You're right. I know you're right. It just hits me sometimes, like waves. I'll be fine for hours, and then suddenly I'm drowning in it." "It hits me too," George admitted, his voice rough. "Every single day. I see something that would make Michael laugh, or I think about calling Sarah for advice, or I remember teaching Daniel to change a tire. And then I remember they're gone. Not dead, which might be easier to process. Just gone. They chose to erase us." They sat together on the dusty floor of their broken house, two elderly people with sore backs and shattered hearts, in a building that was slowly, painfully becoming theirs. Riley walked in 10 minutes later carrying sandwiches from a nearby deli. The good kind, with real meat and fresh vegetables. Her treat, she insisted, though George suspected she was spending money she needed for herself. She found them still sitting there and didn't ask what was wrong. Just sat down, cross-legged beside them, and shared her lunch without comment, giving them space to hurt without making them explain. "My grandmother," Riley said after a while, staring at her sandwich. "She lives alone in Taiwan. I send her money when I can. Call her every Sunday. But it's not enough. I know it's not enough. She raised me when my parents couldn't, gave me everything, taught me what family means, and now I'm here and she's there. And sometimes I wonder if she feels forgotten too." Martha looked at Riley, really seeing her for the first time, not as cheap labor or convenient help, but as a young woman carrying her own weight of family complication and guilt. "You call her every week?" Martha asked softly. "Every Sunday," Riley confirmed. 10 a.m. my time, which is 1 a.m. Monday, her time, but she stays up to talk. We video chat for an hour. She shows me her garden and her cat, and tells me neighborhood gossip in Mandarin that I only half understand anymore. Then she doesn't feel forgotten," Martha said with absolute certainty. "Trust me on that. The calls matter more than you know." Martha sent a video. They ate in companionable silence after that. 3 generations of people learning what it meant to show up for each other, to choose connection despite pain or distance, or the fear of inadequacy. As weeks became a month, word spread through the neighborhood about the elderly couple restoring the Ashford mansion. Reactions were predictably mixed, human nature being what it is. Some neighbors were hostile. The man across the street in the stained undershirt, whose name they learned was Dale, yelled at them one morning to stop making noise with their hammering, even though it was 11 a.m. on a Tuesday. A group of teenagers threw eggs at the house one night, laughing as they ran away. Leaving sticky residue, Martha spent an hour cleaning off the newly repaired siding. Someone spray-painted gentrifiers across their mailbox, which hurt because they were the opposite of gentrifiers. They were just trying to survive. But others were curious, then helpful, then invested. A middle-aged woman named Patricia, different Patricia from the nursing home volunteer, stopped by one afternoon with a casserole still warm from the oven. "Heard you folks were living without a proper kitchen setup," she said, thrusting the dish at Martha. "Thought you could use a real meal. It's nothing fancy, just chicken and rice, but it's hot and filling." An older gentleman named Walter, who lived 2 houses down in a small bungalow with a neat yard, offered to help with the electrical work. "Used to be a union electrician before the plant closed 30 years ago," he explained, showing them his weathered hands. "Don't have much else to do with my time. Might as well keep the skills sharp." A family with young children, the Johnsons, brought over cleaning supplies they'd bought in bulk from Costco. "We don't need all of it," Mrs. Johnson said, though her worn clothes and the condition of their rental suggested otherwise. "Please take some. We're just glad to see someone caring about this neighborhood again." George and Martha, unused to kindness from strangers after so long feeling invisible in Pine Valley's institutional hallways, didn't know how to respond, except to say thank you over and over, until the words felt meaningless. But the gratitude remained profound. One evening in late November, after Riley had gone home and George and Martha sat on their newly repaired porch, watching sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Martha said, "I think people see themselves in us." "How so?" George asked, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the chill. "Everyone in this neighborhood has been forgotten by someone," Martha said thoughtfully. "By the city, by developers, by family members who moved away and stopped calling. They see 2 old people refusing to give up on a house no one wanted. And maybe it reminds them not to give up on themselves, on their block, on the possibility that things can get better." George considered this, rocking slowly. "That's either very profound or very wishful thinking. Can't it be both?" Martha smiled. He smiled back, took her hand. "Yeah, it can be both." As autumn deepened into early winter, the house began to transform in ways both visible and subtle. It was far from finished. Entire rooms remained untouched. The roof still leaked in the northwest corner during heavy rain, and the heating system was more wish than reality. But progress was undeniable to anyone paying attention. The parlor had become their main living space, with actual furniture now, most of it salvaged from Goodwill or donated by neighbors. Mismatched, but functional. The kitchen was operational enough to cook basic meals. One upstairs bedroom had been cleared and cleaned, insulated as best they could manage, turned into their actual bedroom with a real mattress donated by Patricia, who'd upgraded and kept her old one in the garage for years. Riley had documented everything with her camera phone before, during, and after shots that showed the painstaking work in stark detail. She'd created an Instagram account called The Ashford Project. And, without George and Martha's knowledge initially, it had started gaining followers. People loved the story. Elderly couple abandoned by family saves historic mansion with determination and community help. Every post got hundreds of likes, dozens of comments, people sharing their own stories of abandonment and resilience. When Riley finally showed them one evening, scrolling through comments on her phone, Martha was embarrassed. "We look so old in these photos, so tired. You look strong," Riley corrected gently. "People are inspired by you. Look at these comments." George leaned over, squinting at the small text. Someone had written, "This gives me hope that it's never too late to start over. Another, my grandfather is in a nursing home. This makes me want to visit him more. And another, proof that community still exists if we build it. We're just trying to survive, George said, uncomfortable with being seen as inspirational. That's exactly why it inspires them, Riley replied. You're not trying to be heroes. You're just refusing to give up. That's more powerful than any motivational poster. One afternoon in early December, while cleaning out a second-floor hallway closet that had been packed with decades of accumulated junk, George noticed something odd about the wall at the end of the corridor. The wallpaper pattern didn't quite match the surrounding walls, like someone had tried to replicate it, but got it slightly wrong. He pressed against it gently and heard a hollow sound that made his pulse quicken. "Riley!" he called, voice sharp with discovery. "Come, look at this." Riley bounded up the stairs 2 at a time, followed more slowly by Martha, who was learning to trust the restored railing. George tapped the wall again, the sound definitely hollow. "That's not solid," he said, stating the obvious but needing to hear it confirmed. Riley pulled out her phone, turned on the flashlight app, and examined the seam carefully, running her fingers along the edges. "This might be a sealed doorway," she said, excitement building in her voice. Houses like this sometimes had servants' quarters or storage rooms that got closed off during renovations. People would seal them up to save on heating costs or just because they weren't using the space. "Should we open it?" Martha asked, uncertain, almost afraid of the answer. "Absolutely we should open it," Riley said, already pulling tools from her ever-present backpack. "This could be a major architectural feature. We need to document this." It took 3 days of careful work to open the sealed wall without damaging the structure. Riley insisted on proper procedure. They couldn't just bash through with a hammer like some demolition crew. Historic preservation meant respecting what was there, even when you were trying to get past it, understanding that every layer told a story. They removed trim boards carefully, cataloging each piece with photographs and measurements. They pried away plaster with patience, revealing lath beneath, then studs, then finally, a narrow door frame that had been completely concealed behind everything. The door itself was still there, hidden but intact solid oak, painted over multiple times through the decades but fundamentally sound. It had no handle on their side, just a keyhole, dark and mysterious. "It was meant to be hidden from this direction," Riley observed, running her hand over the smooth wood. "See? The trim work was specifically designed to make it disappear. Whoever closed this off wanted it forgotten completely." George tried the door, pushing against it with his shoulder. Locked solid. "Now, what?" "Now we find the key," Riley said, as if it were obvious. As if keys to doors sealed for 40 years just appeared when you needed them. They searched the house systematically after that, whenever they had spare energy, which wasn't often. Martha went through the basement again, checking dusty shelves and forgotten boxes, finding old paint cans and rusted tools and newspapers from 1967 but no keys. George tackled the attic, a space they'd avoided due to questionable flooring and a wasp's nest they'd discovered the first week. But necessity overrode fear. Riley researched Theodore Ashford, the previous owner, spending hours in the local library and historical society on her days off. She learned he'd been an art dealer in the 70s and 80s, moderately successful, but not famous, very private, according to the few people who remembered him. He'd inherited the house from his parents in 1962, lived there alone for 20 years, then died of a heart attack in his study in 1982. No wife, no children. Distant relatives had fought over the estate for years before it finally went to county auction. The weird thing, Riley told George and Martha over dinner one night, spaghetti cooked on their newly functional stove. The three of them crowded around a small table Riley had restored, is that Ashford's business records show he handled millions of dollars in art sales over his career. But his bank account when he died had less than $10,000 in it. Where did all that money go? Bad investments? George suggested, twirling pasta onto his fork. Maybe, Riley said, unconvinced, tapping her fork against her plate. Or maybe he bought something. Something big. Something he kept here. In a sealed room? Martha asked. In a sealed room, Riley confirmed, eyes bright with the thrill of mystery. They were still looking for the key 3 weeks later when December arrived with brutal cold. The house, barely insulated and heated only by space heaters they couldn't afford to run constantly, became a test of endurance and determination. George and Martha wore layers of clothes indoors, looked like walking bundles of fabric. They slept in sleeping bags on their bed, cocooned against the cold. They ate hot soup for almost every meal, just for the warmth, just to feel heat in their bellies. Riley brought them extra blankets and a small electric heater for their bedroom, bought with money from her part-time job at the campus bookstore, money she should have been spending on textbooks or food for herself. You should spend that on yourself, Martha protested when Riley showed up with the heater, guilt heavy in her voice. I'm spending it on myself, Riley said firmly, setting the heater up. You two are the best project I've ever worked on. If you freeze to death, I'll be devastated and I'll fail my semester portfolio. Plus, I really want to know what's behind that door. On December 15th, with snow falling outside and their breath visible even in the kitchen despite the space heater running, Martha was organizing the china cabinet. A beautiful built-in piece, original to the house, with carved details and leaded glass doors. She was checking shelves for stability, testing the wood, when her fingers brushed something unexpected taped to the back panel of the top shelf, hidden behind the decorative trim where no one would look unless they were really examining the construction. A small envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with wax that had cracked and dried to dusty red fragments. Her heart raced like a drum. "George!" she called, voice sharp and urgent. "George! Come here!" He came quickly, alarm on his face, thinking something was wrong, and found her standing on a step stool with something trembling in her hands. "What is it?" "I don't know yet," she breathed, climbing down carefully. They opened the envelope together at the kitchen table, Riley appearing from upstairs where she'd been photographing architectural details, drawn by the tone in Martha's voice. Inside was a key, old, brass, ornate with elaborate scrollwork, and a note in faded ink, the handwriting elegant and deliberate, the words of someone who'd taken time to craft them carefully. For the one who stays, the one who sees value where others see ruin. The collection is yours now. Do with it what I could not. Let the world see beauty again. Theodore Ashford. They stared at the note in stunned silence, the weight of those words settling over them like snow. "He left it deliberately," Riley whispered, touching the paper with reverent fingers. "He hid the room and hid the key, knowing someday someone would care enough to find both, someone who'd stay, someone who wouldn't give up on this house." George held the key, feeling its weight, its history, its promise or threat. What if there's nothing behind that door? What if this is a joke or a mistake, or the ramblings of a dying man? Only one way to find out, Martha said. her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. They went upstairs together. The three of them, two elderly people who'd almost given up, and a young woman who'd shown them how not to. They stood before the hidden door in the hallway, the one they'd so carefully revealed, the mystery they'd been chasing for weeks. George slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, perfectly, like it had been oiled yesterday instead of sealed away for 4 decades. The door swung open on silent hinges. Beyond was darkness, complete and waiting. Riley shone her phone light into the space, and George flipped a light switch just inside the door that, miraculously, impossibly, still worked. The room flooded with light from a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. What they saw in that moment would change everything, would transform their desperate survival into something else entirely, would prove that sometimes broken people find broken houses, and together they discover they were never broken at all, just waiting for each other. But that discovery, that revelation, that moment when everything shifted from despair to impossible hope, that story belonged to what came next. For now, standing in the doorway with light spilling into a room that had been dark for 42 years, George and Martha Brennan held hands and stepped forward together into their future, whatever that might hold. The room that flooded with light was not large, perhaps 20 feet by 20 feet, but every wall was lined with custom-built racks, floor to ceiling, and on those racks hung paintings, dozens of them, scores of them, each one carefully wrapped in archival cloth, each one positioned with mathematical precision, each one waiting in the darkness for someone to find them. And in the center of the room stood a small mahogany desk with a leather-bound journal lying open, as if Theodore Ashford had just stepped away for a moment and would return any second to make another notation, to catalogue another acquisition, to continue his life's work. Martha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. George felt his knees weaken, had to grip the doorframe to stay upright. Riley stood frozen, her phone light still shining uselessly now that the room was bright, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. They stepped inside slowly, reverently, as if entering a church or a tomb, or something sacred that demanded respect. The air smelled different in here, dry, preserved, carefully controlled, even after 4 decades. Not musty or damp, like the rest of the house, but clean, almost sterile. George approached the nearest rack with trembling hands, reached out to touch one of the covered paintings, then stopped himself. "Should we?" he whispered, afraid to disturb whatever this was. "Yes," Riley breathed, her voice barely audible. "Yes, we absolutely should." Martha moved to another rack, her fingers finding the edge of an archival cover. Together, without planning it, they began to unveil what had been hidden. The first painting George uncovered made him step back involuntarily. A canvas perhaps 4 feet by 3 feet, abstract expressionism in brilliant reds and oranges that seemed to pulse with inner light even under the single bare bulb. The brushwork was violent, passionate, alive. In the bottom right corner, a signature he didn't recognize. Martha pulled the cover from hers and gasped. A portrait, photorealistic, a woman's face half in shadow, eyes that followed you no matter where you stood. The detail was extraordinary. Every pore, every eyelash, every strand of hair rendered with impossible precision. Riley moved from painting to painting now, pulling covers with increasing urgency, her breath coming faster. "Oh my God," she kept whispering. "Oh my God, oh my God." They worked in stunned silence for 20 minutes, unveiling piece after piece. Oil paintings, watercolors, mixed media works, landscapes that captured light like bottled sunset, abstract pieces that made your eyes water trying to follow their geometry, portraits that seemed more alive than photographs. Some were small, intimate works that demanded you lean close. Others were massive canvases that dominated entire sections of wall. Every single one was extraordinary, even to George and Martha's untrained eyes. You didn't need to know art history to recognize mastery, to feel the power radiating from these works, to understand you were looking at something important. Riley had stopped moving, was standing in the center of the room, turning slowly in circles, tears streaming down her face. "George," she said, her voice shaking. "Martha, do you understand what this is?" "Paintings," George said stupidly, because his brain had stopped processing normally, overwhelmed by the scope of what they'd found. "Not just paintings," Riley said, moving to one canvas in particular, a riot of colors and shapes that hurt to look at directly. "This is a Rothko, an original Mark Rothko. I saw one like it at MoMA when I was 17. It sold for $47 million. Martha's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the floor, still clutching the archival cloth she'd been holding. Riley moved to another. "This is an early Basquiat, Jean-Michel Basquiat. He died in 1988, and his work has been selling for tens of millions. This could be from before he was famous, which makes it even rarer." She turned to another wall, pointing with a shaking hand. "That's either a Pollock or the world's best forgery. That's a Warhol. Those are 3 de Koonings. That section is all modern Chinese artists who've exploded in value, and I don't even recognize half of these, but the quality, the technique, the preservation." She couldn't finish. Just stood there, shaking her head in disbelief. George forced himself to move to the desk, to the leather journal lying open. His hands trembled as he picked it up, careful with the aged paper. The first page was dated January 3rd, 1965, written in the same elegant script as the note they'd found with the key. "I have begun my collection in earnest. The world doesn't yet recognize these artists, but I believe in my bones they will be remembered. This is my legacy, not money, not property, but beauty preserved for those who will someday understand its worth." Page after page detailed acquisitions dates, artists, amounts paid, provenance notes, written in meticulous detail. Theodore Ashford had spent decades quietly buying art from emerging artists, many of whom went on to become legends, household names, the pillars of modern art history. He'd bought from studios and galleries, from artists directly, sometimes paying them just enough to keep creating, to survive another month, to not give up, and he'd stored it all here, in this hidden room, in his secret gallery, never selling, never showing, never telling anyone what he'd accumulated. Riley was reading over George's shoulder now, turning pages with reverent fingers. "He was a genius," she whispered. "Look at the dates. He bought the Rothko in 1971 for $8,000. He bought the Basquiat in 1980 for $1,200 directly from the artist. He acquired most of these before anyone knew who these people were. He had an eye, a vision. He saw value before the market did." Martha had pulled herself together enough to stand, was examining a painting near the back, a landscape, simple and beautiful, signed by someone named Wyeth. "Why?" she asked, her voice hollow. "Why hide all this? Why not sell it? Live comfortably. Enjoy the money." George turned to the last pages of the journal, found entries that answered her question in Ashford's increasingly shaky handwriting. The script of a man aging, weakening, knowing time was running out. March 1981. Another gallery has contacted me about selling portions of the collection. I declined. They see dollar signs. I see souls. Each of these works represents not just talent, but struggle, risk, the choice to create, despite a world that didn't care. I cannot betray that by turning it into commodity. Better it stays hidden until someone finds it who understands. George read aloud, his voice breaking on the last words. Further down the page, more, July 1982. My health is failing. Dr. Morrison says, my heart won't last another year. I've decided not to tell anyone about the collection. My relatives would squabble over it, sell it piece by piece to the highest bidder. The galleries would take their cuts, and the art would scatter to private collections where no one sees it. Better to seal the room, hide the key, and trust that someday the right person will find it. Someone who sees value in preservation, not profit. Someone who stays. The last entry was dated September 4th, 1982, just weeks before Ashford died. If you're reading this, then I didn't make it. And you did what I couldn't. You stayed in this house when everyone said it was worthless. You saw past the decay to the bones beneath. You're the one I've been waiting for. The collection is yours now. All I ask is this: let people see it. Let the beauty I preserved matter to the world. Don't hide it like I did. Be braver than I was. Martha was crying silently, tears streaming down her face. George felt his own eyes burning. Riley had her arms wrapped around herself, shaking. We need to get this authenticated, Riley finally said, her practical side emerging through the emotion. This could be worth. She paused, calculating. Conservatively, based on what I recognize, we're looking at over $200 million, maybe more. The number hung in the air like something impossible. Like a mathematical error. Like words in a foreign language that made no sense. $200 million, hidden in a house no one wanted. Found by two people everyone had forgotten. I think I need to sit down, George said, then realized he already was sitting. His legs had given out at some point, and he'd ended up on the floor without noticing. They stayed in that room for 3 hours, documenting everything with Riley's phone camera, taking notes, trying to process the magnitude of what they'd discovered. Riley called her professor, Dr. Hammond, from the university, explained what they'd found in breathless, almost incoherent sentences. He promised to come first thing in the morning with proper authentication equipment and contacts at major museums. That night, after Riley had gone home with strict instructions to tell no one yet, George and Martha lay in their bed on the second floor, neither able to sleep, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of their new reality. This changes everything, Martha whispered into the darkness. Does it? George asked. We're still us. Still two old people in a broken house, but we're not broke anymore. We could sell just one painting and have more money than we've ever seen. We could hire contractors to fix everything. We could live comfortably for the rest of our lives. George was quiet for a long time. Is that what you want? Martha thought about it. Really thought. I don't know what I want. Yesterday we were just trying to survive. Today we're sitting on a fortune. I can't process it. My brain won't let me believe it's real. Ashford wanted someone to find it, George said. Someone who stayed. That was us. We stayed when no one else would. We didn't have a choice. Martha pointed out. Maybe that's exactly why we deserve to find it, George replied. We were desperate enough to take a chance no one else would take. Morning came too quickly. Dr. Hammond arrived at 8 with 3 colleagues, all art historians and appraisers from the university and local museums. They spent the entire day in the sealed room, photographing, measuring, analyzing signatures and brushwork, consulting databases and auction records. By evening, they'd confirmed what Riley had suspected. The collection was legitimate, extraordinary, and worth far more than anyone had initially guessed. Several pieces were from artists' most valuable periods. 3 paintings had been thought lost, presumed destroyed. The total conservative estimate, pending full authentication by major auction houses, was $215 million. $215 million. Dr. Hammond, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and glasses, sat with George and Martha at their kitchen table and tried to explain the situation with trembling hands. "What you have upstairs," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "is one of the most significant private art collections discovered in decades. Theodore Ashford had an eye that art dealers would kill for. He bought masterpieces before anyone knew they were masterpieces. This needs to be handled very, very carefully." "What does that mean?" George asked, feeling overwhelmed, feeling like the walls were closing in. "It means you need lawyers, insurance, security, authentication, tax advisors, estate planners. It means your lives are about to change dramatically. And it means," he paused, uncomfortable, "it means you need to be prepared for attention. Lots of it. Lot of." End quote. He was right. Riley had asked Dr. Hammond to keep it quiet, to let George and Martha process before the world found out. But one of Hammond's colleagues posted a carefully worded update on their professional blog that night. "Major art discovery in progress. Details forthcoming." That was all it took. By morning, the art world was buzzing. By noon, reporters had tracked down the address. By evening, news vans were parked outside the house, reporters shouting questions every time George or Martha appeared at a window. "Mr. Brennan, is it true you found millions in artwork? Mrs. Brennan, what will you do with the collection? How does it feel to go from poverty to incredible wealth overnight?" George and Martha stayed inside, curtains drawn, overwhelmed and terrified. They'd called no one, made no statements, tried desperately to understand what was happening to their quiet life that had suddenly exploded into chaos. Riley came over and helped them craft a brief statement through Dr. Hammond. "The Brennan family confirms the discovery of a significant art collection at their property. Details are still being authenticated. They request privacy during this time." It did nothing to stop the media frenzy. Within 3 days, the story had spread nationwide. Abandoned elderly couple discovers $215 million art collection in neglected mansion. Every detail was dissected: their children's abandonment, their desperate purchase of the house, their struggle to survive. The hidden room. The narrative wrote itself. Forgotten couple finds fortune, proves everyone wrong, validates every underdog who ever took a risk. People loved it. The story went viral. George and Martha's faces were suddenly everywhere. News websites, social media, even international papers. Messages poured in from strangers, offering congratulations, telling their own stories of abandonment and resilience, asking for help or advice, or just wanting to say they were inspired. It was overwhelming, wonderful and terrible, and completely overwhelming. But the vultures came quickly, drawn by the scent of money. First were the art dealers, arriving in expensive cars with business cards and promises. "We can handle the authentication, the insurance, the sale. You'll need professionals for this. We've been doing this for decades. Then came the lawyers, dozens of them, offering their services. Estate law is complicated, especially with fines like this. Let us protect your interests. We specialize in high-value discoveries. Then came the historians, curators, academics, all wanting access to view the collection, to document it, to write papers, to be part of the story. George turned them all away from the door, polite but firm, his factory worker stubbornness serving him well. We're not ready to make any decisions. Thank you for your interest, but no. But on day 5 after the news broke, someone knocked who couldn't be turned away so easily. Someone whose presence hit harder than any reporter or art dealer ever could. George opened the door on a cold December morning to find a man in his mid-40s standing on the porch. Tall and well-dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than George's first car. With graying hair and eyes George would have recognized anywhere because they were his own eyes. Inherited and passed down through genetics and time. Hello, Dad. Michael. His oldest son, standing there like no time had passed at all. Like the 31 months of silence meant nothing. Wearing an expression George couldn't quite read. Carefully neutral, professionally composed. The face of a lawyer approaching a client or maybe an adversary. For a long moment, neither moved. George felt like the ground had disappeared beneath his feet, felt Martha come up behind him, heard her sharp intake of breath. Michael, she whispered, and George heard everything in that single word, hope and hurt and anger and love, all tangled together into something that couldn't be separated. Michael stepped forward, not asking permission, just claiming space like he always had. Dad, Mom, can I come in? We need to talk. Martha's hand found George's shoulder, her grip tight enough to hurt. George didn't move from the doorway. About what? He asked, his voice flat, giving nothing away. Michael smiled, but it was his professional smile. The one George had seen him use at his law firm during the one and only time they'd visited his office years ago. I heard about the art discovery. Congratulations. By the way, incredible luck. That word luck hit like a slap. Not hard work, not perseverance, not the desperate risk they'd taken with every dollar they had. Luck. What do you want, Michael? George asked again, still blocking the door. Michael's smile flickered, adjusted. I want to help. I realized you'll need legal protection immediately. Estate issues, tax implications, authentication rights, media management. This is what I do. I'm a corporate lawyer with estate specialization. I want to make sure no one takes advantage of you. Martha's grip on George's shoulder tightened until her nails dug into his flesh through his shirt. Where were you 2 years ago when we needed help paying for my surgery? She asked. Her voice quiet but sharp as broken glass. Michael's smile faltered completely. I know I haven't been present. I was building my career. You know how it is. 80-hour weeks. Demanding clients. But I'm here now. And you need family you can trust. Trust. George repeated, tasting the word like ash, like poison. When exactly did we lose your trust, Michael? What did we do that made you stop calling? Stop visiting? Stop answering our letters? Stop caring whether we lived or died? Michael's professional facade cracked, annoyance flashing across his face before he could control it. Dad, you're making this emotional when it needs to be practical. You're sitting on $215 million, and you have no idea how to handle it. You're not lawyers. You're not art experts. He caught himself, but too late. The sentence hung unfinished but obvious. "We're what?" Martha pressed, stepping forward beside George, her small frame radiating fury. "Old? Stupid? Not worthy of this discovery? Not capable of handling our own affairs?" "I didn't say that," Michael said, his lawyer training taking over. Careful now, parsing his words. "Krista, our lam. You didn't have to," George said. Then, with a finality he didn't know he had in him, he added, "We don't need your help, Michael. We're managing just fine." Michael's eyes hardened, the professional mask slipping completely to reveal something colder underneath. "Fine? You're squatting in a condemned house, playing renovation with some college kid. You have no plan, no protection, and 215 million reasons for people to lie to you, rob you, or worse. But sure, you're managing fine. Better than when we were dying in separate nursing homes, and you couldn't be bothered to answer our calls," Martha said, her voice breaking on the last word, despite her anger. Michael flinched, real emotion crossing his face for the first time. Guilt, maybe, or anger, at being confronted with his absence, with the truth of what he'd done or failed to do. "Mom, No," Martha interrupted, her voice stronger now, fueled by 2 years of suppressed hurt finally finding its voice. "You don't get to mom me now. You don't get to show up with your expensive suit and your lawyer talk. Because suddenly we're worth something financially when we weren't worth a phone call, when we were worth nothing." Michael stood straighter, his lawyer persona returning like armor. "I can see you're upset and not thinking clearly. I'll give you time to cool down, to process. But think about what I said. You need professional help. You need family help. Think about what's best for everyone involved." The way he said everyone made it clear he meant himself. He pulled a business card from his wallet, set it carefully on the porch railing. "Call me when you're ready to be rational. I'm staying at the Marriott downtown for the next few days. I've cleared my schedule to help with this." He walked away without another word, climbed into a BMW with rental plates, and drove off down Marlowe Street, leaving George and Martha standing in the doorway of their broken mansion, arms around each other, watching him disappear. "Did that really just happen?" Martha whispered, her whole body shaking. "Yeah," George said, his own voice unsteady. "It did." Behind them, Riley had witnessed the entire exchange from the hallway, had hung back to give them privacy, but had heard every word. "I'm so sorry," she said softly, coming forward now. "That was awful." George turned to her, and Riley saw something in his face she'd never seen before, a hardness, a determination that went beyond stubbornness into something steel-like. "Riley, you've been with us almost every day, for 3 months. You've never asked for anything. You've helped us when we had nothing to give you. Why?" Riley looked down, uncomfortable with the direct question. "I told you. The house is architecturally. The house is an excuse." Martha interrupted gently, echoing what she'd said before, sensing they needed the truth again. "Tell us the real reason, please." Riley was quiet for a long moment. Then the words came out in a rush. "My parents kicked me out when I came out to them 2 years ago. Told me I was no longer their daughter. That I was an embarrassment. That I should leave and never contact them again. I moved in with my grandmother in Taiwan for a year before coming here for school. She died 6 months after I left. I never got to thank her properly for saving me, for loving me when my parents wouldn't." Tears were streaming down her face now. "When I saw you two at that auction, being laughed at by everyone, being dismissed as crazy, And then I saw you actually buying this impossible house and refusing to give up on it, even when everyone said you should. I don't know. I guess I wanted to be for you what my grandmother was for me. Someone who shows up. Someone who sees your worth even when everyone else writes you off. Someone who stays. Martha pulled Riley into a fierce hug. This girl, who'd become more family in 3 months than their own children had been in 3 years. Oh, sweetheart, you've been exactly that. You've been everything. George cleared his throat roughly, moved despite himself. We're glad you showed up, Riley. We couldn't have done this without you. But the moment of connection was shattered by the shrill ring of the doorbell. George opened it to find a woman in her early 40s, standing there with an older man in a 3-piece suit, their daughter Sarah, and someone who was clearly a lawyer. Behind them in a car sat Daniel, their youngest son, talking on his phone, not even bothering to get out. Mom, Dad, Sarah said, her voice tight and formal. We need to talk about the collection. This is Trevor Michelson, our estate attorney. We've filed a preliminary concern with the county about your ability to manage this discovery given your age and health status. We think for your protection, there should be a conservatorship established. Just temporary. Just to make sure everything's handled properly. George felt Martha sag against him. This wasn't concern. This was a coordinated attack. All 3 children, unified for the first time in years, not by love, but by greed. Get off our property, George said, his voice deadly quiet. Sarah's eyes widened. Dad, you don't understand. 1. I understand perfectly, he said. You abandoned us when we were broke. Now we're wealthy and suddenly you care. Suddenly you're worried about our welfare. Get off our property. The lawyer stepped forward. Mr. Brennan, I understand this is emotional, but your children have legitimate concerns. The courts take elder welfare seriously. If you're deemed unable to manage, we're deemed just fine. Riley interrupted, stepping forward. I've been documenting their restoration work for months. They're sharp, capable, and making rational decisions. If you're threatening legal action, you should know they have support from the university, from the community, and from legal counsel. She was bluffing about the legal counsel, but her voice was confident, her stance protective. The lawyer looked at her dismissively. And you are? And you are. Someone who actually showed up when they needed help. Riley shot back. Sarah's face flushed. This isn't about. We love our parents. We're just concerned that they're being influenced by people who care about them, Martha said, finding her voice, stepping forward beside George. People who were here when you weren't, when I was in surgery, terrified, alone. Where were you, Sarah, when your father had his stroke and called begging you to visit? Where were you? I was working, Sarah said weakly. I sent flowers. You sent flowers, Martha repeated, the words dripping with contempt. Your father almost died, and you sent flowers. Now you show up with lawyers because we found something valuable. Because now we're worth your time. Well, let me tell you something, sweetheart. You don't get to abandon people and then claim you love them when it's convenient. That's not how love works. The lawyer tried again. Mrs. Brennan, emotion aside, the legal question is whether you're trespassing. George interrupted. Which you are. You have 10 seconds to get off our porch, or I'm calling the police. In the car, Daniel had finally gotten out, was walking toward them with his phone still in his hand. Mom, Dad, come on. Let's be reasonable. We're not trying to take anything from you. We're trying to help. You're 73 and 75 years old. You can't handle something this big alone. We're not alone, Martha said, gesturing to Riley. To Walter, who was watching from his porch 2 houses down. To Patricia, who'd come out to see what was happening. We have community. We have people who showed up. We had you once, but you left. And now you need to leave again. The 3 children stood there, their lawyers beside them, facing parents they'd written off, parents who'd somehow survived and found fortune, and were now refusing to play the role of grateful, helpless elderly people who needed saving. Michael spoke up from where he'd returned, apparently coordinating with his siblings. This isn't over. We have legal options. Conservatorship, guardianship, competency hearings. We will protect our parents, whether they understand they need protection or not. You mean you'll protect your inheritance, George said quietly. Don't dress it up as concern. We see you now. Finally see you clearly. And you know what? You're not the people we raised. You're not the children we loved. You're strangers who share our DNA and want our money. That's all you are now. The words hung in the cold December air. Brutal and true and final. Sarah started crying. Daniel looked angry. Michael just looked calculating, already planning his next legal move. You'll regret this, Michael said coldly. When people start taking advantage of you, when the lawsuits start, when the IRS comes knocking, you'll wish you'd accepted our help. If that happens, Martha said, at least we'll face it with people who actually care about us. Now get out, all of you, and don't come back unless you can come as family, instead of as lawyers looking for a payday. They left, finally, their expensive cars pulling away from the curb, leaving George and Martha standing on their porch, shaking with adrenaline and grief and fury. Riley wrapped her arms around both of them. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Don't be, George said, his voice rough but steady. We're not anymore. We finally see the truth. That's not something to apologize for. That night, after Riley left, and the media had finally dispersed, and the neighborhood had gone quiet, George and Martha sat at their kitchen table with cups of tea growing cold between them. They're going to fight us, Martha said. They'll use courts and lawyers and everything they have. I know, George replied. We might lose the collection. They might find a way to take it. Maybe, George acknowledged. But Martha, I'd rather fight them and lose everything than give in and lose ourselves. We didn't survive this far. Didn't rebuild this house. Didn't earn the right to that hidden room just to hand it over to people who abandoned us. Martha reached across the table, took his hands in hers. What do we do? What do we do? George thought about Theodore Ashford, about his final words in the journal. Let people see it. Be braver than I was. We fight back, he said finally. We get real lawyers. We protect what's ours. And we decide what to do with this collection on our own terms, not theirs. What would you want to do? Martha asked. George looked around their kitchen, scarred but clean, filled with mismatched dishes donated by neighbors, warmed by space heaters they'd learned to afford. He thought about Riley and Walter and Patricia and all the people who'd shown up. He thought about Theodore Ashford hiding beauty because he was afraid the world would ruin it. I think, George said slowly, we should do something bigger than ourselves. Something that helps people like us. Something that proves abandoned people can build something that matters. Martha smiled for the first time since Michael had appeared on their porch. "I was hoping you'd say that." They sat together as the night deepened around them. Two elderly people facing the biggest fight of their lives, threatened by their own children, overwhelmed by fortune they'd never expected, but united in purpose and surprisingly unafraid. They'd survived abandonment. They'd survived poverty. They'd survived the risk that everyone said would destroy them. They could survive this too. And whatever happened next, whatever legal battles lay ahead, whatever cruelty their children could conjure, George and Martha Brennan would face it together, with dignity, with community, and with the unshakable conviction that they'd earned the right to determine their own destiny. The art collection belonged to them, legally and morally. Theodore Ashford had left it for someone who stayed, someone who saw value in what others abandoned. That was them. And no one, not lawyers, not children, not anyone was going to take that away without the fight of their lives. The legal battles came quickly and brutally. Within a week of their children's coordinated attack, George and Martha found themselves buried under paperwork petitions for competency hearings, guardianship filings, claims that they were being unduly influenced by outsiders with predatory intentions. Michael, Sarah, and Daniel had apparently unified for the first time in their adult lives, not through love, but through the magnetic pull of $215 million. Claire Washington, the elder law attorney Riley had connected them with, reviewed the filings with barely concealed disgust. She was in her 60s herself, sharp-eyed and silver-haired, with the kind of controlled fury that came from spending decades watching families tear themselves apart over money. Your children are arguing. You're not competent to manage your affairs, Claire explained in their first official meeting. Spread out at George and Martha's kitchen table, with documents covering every inch of surface. They're claiming diminished capacity due to age, that you're living in unsafe conditions, that you're being manipulated by younger people seeking financial gain. It's a standard playbook for elder financial abuse cases, except usually it's strangers doing the manipulating, not the adult children accusing their parents of being incompetent. Can they win? Martha asked, her voice tight with fear she was trying to hide. Not if I have anything to say about it, Claire replied firmly. You legally purchased this property through a valid auction. Theodore Ashford's will left everything to his estate, which was liquidated through that auction. Anything found on the property is legally yours. Your children have no claim ethically or legally unless we let them bully you into giving them one. The evaluations were worse than humiliating, they were dehumanizing. George and Martha had to sit through hours of questions designed to determine if they could make their own decisions. What year is it? Who's the president? Count backwards from 100 by sevens. How would you handle various financial scenarios? A psychologist interviewed them, assessed their mental clarity, asked intrusive questions about their relationship, their reasoning abilities, their daily functioning, treating them like children or criminals or specimens under examination, rather than human beings with dignity and rights. George found it degrading beyond words. Martha found it enraging, in ways that made her hands shake with suppressed fury. My own children, she said, after one particularly brutal 4-hour session that left them both exhausted and hollow, are trying to have me declared incompetent because I won't give them money. How is that not abuse? How is that not exactly what elder abuse looks like? Claire nodded with grim understanding. It's called elder financial abuse, and it's far more common than people realize. The system is supposed to protect vulnerable seniors, but it's often weaponized by greedy relatives who see their parents as obstacles to inheritance, rather than as people deserving respect. In the end, every evaluation came back the same. George and Martha were sharp, cogent, fully capable of managing their own affairs. They passed every cognitive test with scores that would have been impressive for people half their age. The judge dismissed all 3 guardianship petitions with barely concealed irritation, admonishing Michael, Sarah, and Daniel for wasting the court's time and taxpayer resources on what appeared to be nothing more than a transparent money grab. But the children weren't done. They pivoted to a new strategy, one more insidious because it worked through public perception rather than legal force. Suddenly, Michael was giving interviews to local news stations, his face arranged in expressions of concerned sorrow. "We're just worried about our parents. They're elderly. They're living in a house that's barely habitable, and they're surrounded by strangers who may not have their best interests at heart. We love them and want to help." Sarah posted on Facebook, her words carefully crafted to paint her as the concerned daughter fighting against manipulation. "Please pray for my parents. They're confused and being taken advantage of by people who see them as a path to fortune. We're trying to protect them, but they won't let us near. If you love your parents, hold them close. Don't let strangers come between you." Daniel went on a podcast about elder care, positioning himself as the anguished son trying to save his parents from predatory opportunists. "The system failed them," he said, voice heavy with manufactured emotion. "And now we're watching helplessly as they're influenced by people who showed up only after the money was discovered." The narrative shifted in some circles. Suddenly, articles began appearing questioning whether George and Martha were victims, not of their children, but of Riley, and the lawyers, and everyone else, circling the wagons around a fortune. Were these elderly people being manipulated? Were they competent enough to resist predatory influence? Should the state intervene for their own protection? "They're rewriting history," George said one evening, reading yet another article that portrayed them as helpless elderly people, being puppeteered by scheming opportunists. His hands trembled with rage as he scrolled through comments sections filled with armchair experts debating their mental capacity. "Let them," Claire advised during an emergency phone call. "Your children are building a case in the court of public opinion because they've lost in actual court. But public opinion doesn't determine legal ownership. The law is clear. The collection is yours. Stay focused on what matters." Through all of this, Riley documented everything with quiet, determined purpose. Her Instagram account, The Ashford Project, now had over 200,000 followers invested in the story. She posted daily updates that served as counter-narrative to the children's spin photos of George installing new light fixtures. With steady, capable hands, videos of Martha teaching neighborhood kids about historic preservation and architecture, testimonials from Walter and Patricia and the Johnsons about how George and Martha had brought life back to a dying neighborhood. The truth was harder to sensationalize than the lies, required more attention span than clickbait headlines, but it was truth nonetheless, and it resonated with people who understood that dignity doesn't diminish with age. 2 months into the legal battle, with winter giving way to early spring, Claire called a meeting. "The authentication reports are back from 3 independent experts," she said, opening her briefcase with deliberate care. "I wanted to tell you in person because this is significant." George and Martha sat at their kitchen table, now refinished and beautiful, one of Walter's projects, holding hands beneath it like they always did when facing news that might change everything. Claire pulled out a thick report, pages bound in leather, official seals embossed on the cover. The collection has been authenticated by experts from Christie's, Sotheby's, and the Smithsonian. It's legitimate. Everything Theodore Ashford documented in his journal is confirmed accurate. Every provenance checks out. Every signature is genuine. She looked up, meeting their eyes. And the conservative estimate of $200 million. That was significantly low. Let's stayed, she paused, letting them brace themselves. The actual value, accounting for pieces that have appreciated dramatically since Ashford's death and taking into account rarity and condition, is closer to $215 million, possibly higher depending on auction performance. But $215 million is the baseline appraisal. The number still felt impossible, even after months of knowing it existed. $215 million. Hidden in a house they'd bought for $16,000. Found by two people the world had discarded as worthless. Martha made a sound between a laugh and a sob, her hand flying to her mouth. George just stared at the report, his mind struggling to process zeros that had no meaning in his lived experience. "What happens now?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire closed the report carefully, reverently. "Now, you decide what you want to do with it. You have options: sell it, donate it, keep it, create a foundation, establish a trust. Whatever you want, it's yours. Legally, ethically, morally, completely." She paused, her expression softening. "Your children will continue to fight, I'm sure. They'll appeal. They'll try new legal angles. They'll make this as difficult as possible. But they can't win. Not unless you let them. The law is entirely on your side." George looked at Martha. After 53 years of marriage, entire conversations could happen in a single glance. Complex negotiations conducted through subtle shifts in expression, and the pressure of hands held beneath tables. They'd spent 3 months being dragged through courts and competency evaluations. 3 months of their children treating them like obstacles instead of parents. 3 months of realizing that the people they'd raised and loved and sacrificed everything for had grown into strangers who saw them as nothing more than a means to wealth, a problem to be solved, a barrier to inheritance. The grief was oceanic, vast and deep and drowning. But so was the clarity it brought. "We're not giving them anything," Martha said firmly, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Not one painting, not $1. Not now. Not ever." George nodded slowly, certainty settling into his bones. "They want to act like we're already dead, like they've inherited what's ours before we're even gone. They can wait until we actually are gone. And even then, I'm not sure they deserve anything. Until then, we're doing something better with it." "What did you have in mind?" Claire asked, though her slight smile suggested she already knew. George and Martha looked at each other again, and in that look was 53 years of partnership, of struggle, of learning that the measure of a life isn't what you accumulate but what you give, what you build, what you leave behind. That matters more than money. "We want to create something that lasts," George said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Something that helps people like us, people everyone's forgotten. People society has written off." Martha continued, picking up his thought like they were one mind speaking through two mouths. "A community center, maybe. An art museum with free admission, so beauty isn't just for rich people. Programs for elderly people who need housing or health care, or just someone to remember they exist. Something that matters more than money ever could." Claire's smile widened into something fierce and proud. "I think we can make that happen. I think we can make that happen beautifully." By the time they finished planning that afternoon, the sun had set. George and Martha sat alone in their kitchen after Claire left, drinking tea that had long since gone cold, holding hands across the table they'd refinished together, in the house they'd saved, contemplating a decision that would define not just their legacy, but their souls. "Do you regret it?" Martha asked softly, voicing the question that had been hovering unspoken. "Do you wish they'd been different? Our children?" George thought about it with the honesty that 5 decades together demanded. "Yes," he said finally, not sugar-coating the pain. "I regret that we didn't get to know who they became as adults because they shut us out before we could. I regret that they don't understand what we tried to teach them about family and sacrifice and showing up. I regret that they'll never know what they gave up when they abandoned us, not the money, but us, the relationship, the love, everything that matters." He squeezed her hand harder. "But I don't regret us. I don't regret this house, or this discovery, or this decision. They taught us something important, something painful but true, that family isn't just blood. Family is who shows up. Family is who stays." Martha looked around their kitchen, scarred but sturdy, filled with mismatched dishes donated by neighbors, warmed by heating they'd learned to afford, decorated with Riley's photographs and children's drawings from the neighborhood. It wasn't much compared to the mansions their children lived in, but it was full of more genuine love than those empty houses would ever hold. "Who shows up?" Martha repeated softly. "Like Riley, like Walter and Patricia, and Claire and all the people who had nothing to gain from helping us except the satisfaction of being good humans. Like us," George added. "We showed up for each other when no one else would, and now we're going to show up for others the way we wish someone had shown up for us." The formal announcement came on a mild April morning, exactly 6 months after they'd first walked through the doors of their broken mansion. The neighborhood had been transformed, not just the Victorian, though that gleamed with fresh paint and restored trim, but the entire street. Word of George and Martha's plans had spread, and property values had begun to stabilize, then rise. People were investing in their homes again, planting gardens, fixing fences, believing that maybe this neighborhood wasn't dying after all. Reporters gathered again outside the mansion, but this time George and Martha had invited them. They stood on their rebuilt porch, hand in hand, with Riley beside them and Claire Washington on the other side. Walter and Patricia and the Johnsons and dozens of neighbors filled the yard. Behind them, a professional sign was draped across the front of the house, covered with a tarp. George cleared his throat and spoke into the microphone someone had provided, his voice steady despite nerves that made his hands tremble. 6 months ago, my wife and I bought this house because we had nowhere else to go. We were elderly, broke, and abandoned by our own children. Society had written us off as worthless. We'd almost written ourselves off." He paused, looking at Martha, who nodded encouragement through her own tears. "But we found something here. Not just hidden artwork worth a fortune, but something more valuable than any amount of money. We found community. We found purpose. We found people who showed up not because we had wealth, but because they believed something broken could be fixed, and was worth the effort of fixing." Martha took over, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the crowd. "Today we're announcing the formation of the Ashford Brennan Foundation. 100% of the art collection, authenticated at over $215 million, will be sold through proper channels over the next 2 years, and the proceeds will fund 3 permanent initiatives." Riley pulled the tarp away from the sign with theatrical flair. It read in elegant script, "The Ashford Brennan Community Center. Art, housing, and hope. George continued. Reading from notes Martha had helped him prepare. First, this house will become a free public community art museum and cultural center, open to everyone forever. The Theodore Ashford collection will be displayed here, not all the originals. Those will be sold to fund our programs, but museum-quality reproductions so that beauty isn't hidden away but shared, especially with people who might never otherwise see art like this. No admission fee, no barriers, just beauty, available to all, Martha added, her voice thick with emotion. Second, we're establishing a housing fund for elderly people facing homelessness or unsafe living conditions. We're purchasing properties in this neighborhood and in similar forgotten places, converting them to affordable senior housing with dignity and autonomy. No one should have to die in a nursing home they hate, separated from their spouse, because they can't afford better. We lived that nightmare. We're making sure others don't have to, George finished. And third, we're creating an endowment for intergenerational programs that pair young people with elderly community members, mentorship, skill sharing, companionship, mutual learning. Because we learned from Riley that what saves people isn't money, it's connection, it's being seen, it's mattering to someone. The reporters erupted with questions, hands shooting up, voices overlapping. George and Martha answered them patiently, calmly, with a clarity that came from months of being tested in fire and not breaking, from suffering that had burned away everything except essential truth. What about your children? One reporter asked, the question everyone wanted answered. Have they responded to this news? Martha's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes hardened like steel cooling. Our children made their choices. We've made ours. The foundation is our legacy now. Whatever relationship is possible with our children in the future will be on our terms as people who deserve respect and love, not as a resource to be exploited or controlled. Do you forgive them? Another reporter pressed. George answered with painful honesty. We're working on that. Forgiveness isn't a light switch you flip. It's a process, a choice you make every day. But we're not letting unforgiveness poison what we're building here. They don't get that power over us anymore. They've taken enough. They don't get our joy too. Over the following months, the foundation took shape with remarkable speed. Fueled by Claire's legal expertise, Riley's organizational skills, and an outpouring of support from people inspired by the story. Donations poured in from strangers, not large amounts, but hundreds of thousands of small gifts from ordinary people who saw themselves in George and Martha's struggle and wanted to be part of what they were building. The art was authenticated, catalogued, and prepared for sale through major auction houses over a 2-year timeline designed to maximize value and minimize market flooding. Each piece was photographed extensively with detailed provenance documentation, and those images became part of the permanent museum collection, so that even after the originals were sold, people could still see and learn from what Theodore Ashford had preserved. The first piece went to auction in July, the Rothko, that had been appraised at $11 million. George and Martha watched the live stream from their living room, surrounded by Riley, Walter, Patricia, the Johnsons, and dozens of neighbors who'd become family, who'd shown up. The bidding started at $5 million. Within 10 minutes, it had reached $15 million. Phone bidders from around the world competed. The energy was electric even through a computer screen. When the gavel finally fell at $18,700,000, the room erupted in cheers. Martha cried, not from joy at the money, but from the weight of what it represented: validation, opportunity, The power to help in ways that mattered. Theodore Ashford spent 30 years collecting this art, she said through her tears, speaking to no one and everyone, hiding it because he was afraid people would ruin it by fighting over it, by reducing beauty to dollars. And now we get to use it to help people, to create beauty in people's lives, instead of just preserving it on walls. He'd be proud of that, I think. I hope he would be. George pulled her close, his own eyes wet. I think he would be. I think that's exactly what he wanted. Someone who understood that art's value isn't in its price, but in its power to change lives. The housing initiative launched in September with a ceremony that drew city officials, housing advocates, and media coverage that spread the story nationally. The foundation had purchased 6 dilapidated houses within 8 blocks of the mansion, and 2 small apartment buildings that had been condemned, then renovated them completely, not as shelters or institutions, but as real homes with full kitchens, private bedrooms, accessible bathrooms, gardens, and most importantly, dignity and autonomy. The first residents moved in on a cool October morning exactly 1 year after George and Martha had first arrived at their mansion. There were 8 elderly couples and 6 widowed individuals, all of whom had been facing homelessness, institutional care they couldn't afford, or unsafe conditions that threatened their health and safety. One woman, Dolores, 82 years old with hands gnarled by arthritis, had been living in her car for 9 months after her landlord raised rent beyond her fixed income. Another man, Frank, 79, had been in a nursing home where he was neglected and, he quietly admitted, abused by staff who saw him as a burden rather than a person. Martha met each of them personally, walking them through their new apartments, explaining that rent would be based on their income using a sliding scale, that they had full autonomy over their space and their lives, that this was their home for as long as they wanted it, that no one would force them out or separate them from spouses, or treat them as anything less than the adults they were. Dolores, a tiny woman with a voice made strong by surviving everything life had thrown at her, gripped Martha's arm and whispered, "Why are you doing this for us? What do you get out of it?" Martha looked her in the eye with absolute directness. "Because 1 year ago, I was you. I was facing separation from my husband, institutionalization I couldn't afford, a future where I'd die alone in a place that didn't care if I lived or died. And someone, not a person, but a house and a hidden gift and a community showed up for me. Now, I'm showing up for you." Dolores wept into Martha's shoulder, and George had to step outside because his own emotions were too close to the surface, threatening to overwhelm him. The community center officially opened in November with an exhibition called Hidden Beauty, the Theodore Ashford Collection: Art, Memory, and the Power of Staying. By then, half the paintings had been sold, their proceeds funding renovations, housing purchases, and program development. The museum displayed museum-quality reproductions alongside the remaining originals, waiting for auction, telling the full story of how Ashford had spent his life collecting art from artists no one else believed in yet, and how George and Martha had found it and chosen to share it rather than hoard it. Over 3,000 people attended opening weekend. They came from neighboring towns, from across the state, from across the country. They came because they'd followed George and Martha's story online. They came because free museums were rare and precious. They came because beauty matters, even especially in forgotten neighborhoods that had been written off by everyone with power. George gave tours, talking about the house's history, its restoration, Theodore Ashford's vision, and the decision to create something that served community rather than enriched individuals. Martha taught classes on basic home repair and financial literacy for elderly people who'd never learned, who'd been told they didn't need to know, who'd been kept dependent and now wanted independence. Riley ran programs for teens interested in historic preservation, art history, and community development. The Intergenerational Mentorship Program launched in January with 40 pairs of young and elderly participants, matched by interests and availability. They met weekly, sometimes for practical skills, like a retired carpenter teaching a high school student woodworking, or a former seamstress teaching embroidery to college students. Sometimes just for conversation, for connection, for the radical act of different generations choosing to see each other as fully human and worthy of attention. Riley was paired with Agnes, 93 years old, who'd been a seamstress her whole life and still had steady hands despite arthritis. Agnes taught Riley to hand-sew historical garments using techniques that weren't in textbooks. Riley taught Agnes to use Instagram and video chat so she could connect with grandchildren who'd moved across the country. They became inseparable, choosing each other as family in ways biology had never managed. This, Agnes told Martha one afternoon as they watched Riley and a group of teens carefully reupholster antique furniture under her guidance. This is what life is supposed to be. Not age-segregated warehouses where old people wait to die and young people forget we exist, but communities where we all need each other, where we all have something to give and receive. Martha hugged her fiercely. This woman, who'd become a friend and inspiration. That's exactly what we're trying to build. You're helping us do it. As winter turned again to spring, marking 18 months since George and Martha had bought the mansion, they received a letter. It came to the foundation's office address, not their home. Addressed in handwriting Martha recognized instantly. Sarah's, their daughter's. The curves and loops familiar from childhood thank you notes and birthday cards from a lifetime ago. George and Martha sat in what had become their private office, a small room on the second floor of the mansion. Comfortable, but not ostentatious, with windows overlooking the garden that had been restored and now bloomed with flowers planted by volunteers, and opened it together. The letter was 4 pages. Handwritten, several words crossed out and rewritten, evidence of struggle in its composition. Dear Mom and Dad, it began, and Martha's hands started shaking immediately. I don't know if you'll read this or if you'll throw it away. Both would be understandable. I've been watching from a distance, following the Foundation's progress, reading articles, seeing Riley's posts, and I've been forced to confront something terrible. I was wrong, not just wrong about the money or the art or the house. Wrong about you. Wrong about what matters. Wrong about everything I thought success meant. When you wouldn't give us access to the collection, when you established the Foundation instead, I was furious. I thought you were being stubborn and vindictive. But watching what you've built instead, watching you create something that helps people, rather than enriches your children who don't deserve it, I finally understand what you tried to teach us our whole lives, that love is measured by what you give, not what you keep. That family is about showing up, not taking. I abandoned you. Trevor and I both did. Not just in the last 3 years, but long before that. We stopped calling, stopped visiting, told ourselves we were too busy, that you were fine, that we'd make it up to you later. And by the time later came, you didn't need us anymore. You'd built something better without us. I can't fix what I did. I can't give you back the 3 years you spent alone and afraid and abandoned. I can't erase the court battles or the awful things we said about you being incompetent. But I want to try to do better. Not for the money, I know I'm not entitled to that. And honestly, what you're doing with it is better than anything I would have done. Not even for forgiveness, though I want that desperately. Just to be your daughter again, if you'll let me, to show up the way I should have all along. I don't expect a response. I don't expect anything. I just needed you to know that I see what I did. I understand the pain I caused, and I'm sorry. You were right about everything that matters. I love you, even though I didn't show it. I'm proud of you, even though I have no right to be. And I miss you, even though it's my own fault that I do. I understand if you never want to see me again. I've earned that. But if you ever want to talk, I'm here. I'll wait. I'll keep waiting. Because that's what you did for me for years. And I finally understand what that must have cost you. Your daughter, Sarah. Martha read it twice. 3 times. Tears streaming down her face, leaving wet spots on the paper. George read it once, his jaw tight, emotions warring visibly across his weathered features, anger and hurt and hope and love, all tangled into something that couldn't be separated cleanly. What do you think? Martha asked, finally, her voice small and uncertain. George set the letter down carefully, as if it might explode. I think she's 18 months too late. But I also think it's the first honest thing any of our children have said to us in years. Maybe ever. Unquote. Do we respond? Martha's hands twisted in her lap. George thought about it for a long time, staring out the window at the garden, where children were playing under Agnes's watchful eye, where life and growth and beauty bloomed from soil that had been neglected for decades. Not yet, he said finally. Maybe not ever. Or maybe someday when we're ready. When it doesn't hurt quite so much. But Martha, this letter doesn't erase what they did. It doesn't fix the abandonment or take away the years we spent suffering because they couldn't be bothered to care. Words matter, Martha said softly. So do actions, George replied. And for 3 years, their actions said we didn't matter, that we were disposable, that we were only worth their time if we had something they wanted. One letter doesn't change that history. Martha nodded slowly, understanding but still hurting. But we're not throwing it away, either. No, George agreed. We're not throwing it away. They filed it carefully in a folder labeled Children, alongside photos from when Michael, Sarah, and Daniel were young, smiling, innocent, still theirs, in ways they might never be again. Maybe someday they'd respond. Maybe someday forgiveness would feel possible instead of like betrayal of their own pain. But not today. Today they had work to do, people to help, a legacy to build that mattered more than broken relationships with people who'd chosen to break them. One evening in late spring, almost 2 years after buying the mansion, George and Martha sat on their porch swing, a beautiful handcrafted piece made by Walter, who'd become their closest friend besides Riley, who'd shown them that family is built through choice and presence, not blood and biology. They watched sunset paint the Victorian mansion in shades of gold and rose, watched children playing in the street that had been empty and dangerous 2 years ago, watched neighbors tending gardens and talking on porches, and building the kind of community that had seemed impossible when they'd first arrived. The house was no longer empty or haunted or forgotten. Lights glowed in windows where community classes were being held. ESL for immigrants, computer skills for seniors, art classes for kids who'd never held a paintbrush. Laughter drifted from the garden where a group of teenagers and elderly residents were planting vegetables together under Agnes's patient instruction. Through an open window, piano music floated out a young girl, learning from an elderly teacher who'd played professionally before arthritis forced retirement, but not before she could pass on knowledge and beauty. "We did it," Martha said quietly, her voice full of wonder. "We actually did it." George took her hand, their fingers interlocking automatically after 55 years of practice. "We're not done yet." "No," she agreed, smiling. "We're not done yet, but we're here, we're together, and we matter." They rocked in companionable silence, listening to the life they'd created, the community they'd nurtured, the purpose they'd discovered in what everyone else had seen as disaster. After a while, Riley walked out carrying 3 glasses of lemonade, setting them on the small table beside the swing with the easy familiarity of family. "How was the tour?" George asked, knowing Riley had been leading a group through the museum. "Good," Riley said, settling into a nearby chair that creaked comfortably. "Had a group from a retirement community 4 towns over. They were so inspired. One woman, probably 85, told me this place makes her believe it's never too late to matter, to contribute, to be seen." Martha's eyes filled with tears for the 1,000th time that year, happy tears, grateful tears, overwhelmed tears. "That's exactly what we wanted, for people to know they haven't been forgotten. You two have become something you never asked to be," Riley said gently. "Symbols of hope for elderly people everywhere who feel invisible, proof that it's never too late to start over, to build something meaningful, to refuse to be discarded." George shifted uncomfortably. "We're not symbols. We're just 2 old people who got lucky and tried to do something decent with it." "Luck is finding art in a wall," Riley countered. "What you did with it, that's not luck. That's character. That's love. That's choosing to be better than the people who hurt you instead of becoming like them." As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, George and Martha sat surrounded by the sounds of community voices, music, laughter, life, the opposite of silence and abandonment. The mansion that had been empty for 42 years was full again, bursting with purpose and connection. The neighborhood that had been dying was reviving, block by block. And 2 elderly people who'd been abandoned and forgotten had become the heart of something bigger than they'd ever imagined possible. Their children might never come back, not in any meaningful way. The grief of that loss would probably never fully heal, would always be a scar they carried. But George and Martha had learned something profound through pain. You can lose your family of blood and still build a family of choice. You can be broken by abandonment and still create beauty from the pieces. You can be written off by the world and still write your own story that matters more than any story anyone else tells about you. They'd turned $16,000, endless grit, and impossible hope into a legacy worth more than $215 million. But the real fortune wasn't the money. It was this: a community rebuilt, elderly people housed with dignity, young people connected to wisdom and history, art shared instead of hoarded, and love fierce, stubborn, unbreakable love proven stronger than abandonment, greed, or age. "Thank you," Martha whispered to George, as they rocked together, the swing creaking its familiar rhythm. "For what? For not giving up, for taking this chance with me, for being my partner in this ridiculous, impossible dream that everyone said would destroy us." George kissed her temple softly, gently, with 55 years of accumulated tenderness. "Martha, you're the easiest person in the world to not give up on. Even when I wanted to quit, even when it seemed hopeless, You made me want to keep trying. You make everything better just by being you." They sat until full dark, until the last class ended and the final volunteers said goodnight with hugs and promises to return tomorrow, until it was just them and Riley and the quiet house settling around them like a contented sigh. Michael had sent no more letters. Daniel had made no more calls. Only Sarah had reached out, and they hadn't been able to respond yet, might never be able to respond in the way she wanted. And George and Martha had made peace with that silence, that absence. They'd opened the door to reconciliation in their hearts, but they wouldn't chase children who'd chosen to leave. They'd built something better than grudges or demands or desperate attempts to fix what their children had broken. They'd built a life so full of meaning that their children's absence, while painful, wasn't devastating. As Riley helped them inside for the night, turning off lights and locking doors and checking that the museum was secure, George paused in the hallway, outside the room that had changed everything. The hidden room was empty now. All the art either sold or in climate-controlled museum storage. But he could still feel it, the weight of Theodore Ashford's gift, the trust he'd placed in whoever found it, the faith that someone would use it wisely. "We did right by him," George said softly. "We did right by everyone," Martha replied. "By Theodore, by the people we're helping, by each other. That's enough. That's more than enough." They climbed the stairs slowly, bodies aching but spirits full, to the bedroom they'd restored together. And as they settled into sleep, holding hands across the space between their bodies like they'd done for 55 years, they felt something rare and precious. Peace. Not the peace of having no problems, but the peace of knowing you've lived according to your values. You've chosen love over bitterness. You've built something that will outlast you and matter to people you'll never meet. Anyone can choose to show up when it matters, to believe that broken things deserve repair, to build something beautiful from what everyone else throws away. Because at the end of everything, after the money is counted and the headlines fade and the years pass, what remains is simpler and more profound. Did you show up? Did you stay? Did you love? Did you use what you were given to make the world better, even in small ways? George and Martha Brennan had answered yes to all those questions. And in doing so, they'd taught an entire community that second chances aren't about luck or windfalls or hidden fortunes. They're about the courage to keep trying when it would be easier to quit. They're about choosing connection over isolation, generosity over greed, purpose over comfort. They're about refusing to let the world's cruelty make you cruel in return. They're about being brave enough to believe that even at 73 and 75, with bodies breaking down and hearts already broken, you can still build something that matters, something that echoes beyond your own life, into the lives of others. On that spring evening, surrounded by the life they'd created, George and Martha Brennan finally understood completely what Theodore Ashford had known when he sealed that room 42 years ago. Some treasures are meant to be found by people strong enough to use them wisely. People who understand that the greatest wealth isn't what you keep, but what you give. Isn't measured in dollars, but in lives touched, and communities healed, and people reminded that they matter. They'd been exactly those people, and the house that no one wanted had become home to a love story bigger than any fortune. A story about two elderly people, abandoned by their children, who chose to love a whole community instead, and in doing so, showed the world what true legacy looks like. Not money passed down to ungrateful heirs, not property that enriches people who don't deserve it, but purpose, connection, dignity, and hope offered freely to anyone who needs it. especially to those the world has forgotten. That was wealth. That was legacy. That was love. And it would outlast them, echoing through the lives of everyone they'd touched, rippling outward in ways they'd never fully see but could trust existed, expanding like light, like hope, like the best parts of being human. The end. Up next, two more powerful stories about courage, community, and second chances. Click to keep going with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that abandoned dreams still deserve to bloom, that forgotten people still deserve to be seen, and that it's never too late to build something beautiful from broken pieces.